Welcome to the Jewel Town series. Sit back, relax, and let's listen to ghost stories. I learned stories the old way, not from screens, not from streaming, but from a circle of people sitting around a fire that threw shadows on the trees. I was a Boy Scout then, and there was another boy, Bob Beecham, who could hold a whole campsite in the palm of his hand. He had a voice like a radio announcer, even as a kid. Smooth, confident, a little theatrical. When he told ghost stories, the woods went quiet. Every crack of a twig sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind felt like something passing behind you. That was my first education in storytelling, not structure, not theory presence. Years later, I found that same presence in other places. In Stephen King's haunted New England, in Garrison Keillor's gentle, winding monologues, in old radio shows like Mystery Theater that began with an invitation. I am an author, and I decided to write a series of books I wanted to sell, but I also am a lover of stories. For now, I am sharing a couple of chapters from the Mirror of Venice. The Mirror manuscript is a gothic, atmospheric tale of craft, obsession, and the dangerous clarity of seeing oneself too clearly. In a quiet Venetian village where the Bellini family has shaped glass for generations, a nobleman commissions a mirror that sees perfectly. The result is a flawless creation, too flawless. Once installed in Alessandro Violi's estate, the mirror begins to behave strangely. Reflections blink a heartbeat late, expressions shift on their own, and visitors feel unmistakably watched. Even Violi sees emotions in the glass he never felt himself. Whispers spread of a mirror that remembers, a mirror that responds. As curiosity turns to unease, and unease to fear, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Something inside the glass is waking. Soon, I would like to introduce you to Jewel Town series, which takes place in a haunted coastal Rhode Island town. I am just moving my stuff in, so please don't mind the mess. Welcome to Jewel Town and the Mirror of Venice.
Chapter 1. The village of glass morning mist rose from the Venetian lagoons in pale ribbons that drifted between the houses of the village before dissolving in the sunlight. From a distance, the place appeared almost unreal, as if it had been painted upon the water rather than built upon land. Narrow canals threaded between stone buildings, their surfaces broken only by the quiet movement of small boats and the occasional cry of gulls circling overhead. To visitors, it seemed peaceful. To the Bellini family, it smelled of smoke. The furnace behind their home had burned nearly every day for 3 generations, and its breath drifted through the village like the memory of fire. Even before sunrise, the chimney exhaled a thin gray plume that mixed with the morning fog, marking the workshop as clearly as any church steeple. Inside the furnace house, the air shimmered with heat. Adriano Bellini stood near the great oven with his sleeves rolled above his elbows, watching the molten glass rotate slowly at the end of his iron rod. The glowing mass turned with hypnotic grace, a droplet of captured sunlight balanced at the tip of metal. The furnace roared beside him, its open mouth blazing white and gold. Sweat ran along his neck despite the chill outside. "Too fast," said Luca from across the room. Adriano rolled his eyes but slowed the rotation slightly. "It isn't too fast. It is if you want it to remain round." Luca Bellini had the irritating habit of being correct. The older brother moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had repeated the same careful motions 10,000 times before breakfast. Where Adriano's workbench held scattered tools and scraps of cooled glass, Luca's station looked almost ceremonial in its order. He stepped closer now, peering at the molten form. "You're thinking instead of watching," Luca said. "I can do both." "No, you imagine things." Adriano smirked faintly. "Imagination is not a crime. In glassmaking it can be." The rod turned steadily between Adriano's palms as he studied the glowing shape. The glass shimmered like living honey. Within its molten depths, faint currents twisted and folded, following invisible patterns that fascinated him every time he looked closely enough. Glass was strange that way. It appeared solid when finished, yet in its molten state it behaved almost like water that remembered it had once been sand. Their father used to say the material possessed a memory. Adriano suspected the old man might actually believe it. A heavy step sounded behind them. "Luca is right," said a voice that carried the weight of years and smoke. Matteo Bellini entered the workshop, wiping his hands on a cloth darkened by soot. His shoulders were broad, his hair streaked with iron gray, and the skin of his hands bore countless pale scars from decades spent beside furnaces. He approached the rod and watched the glowing glass turn. For a bowl, it would not matter, Matteo said calmly. But this piece must be perfect, Adriano sighed. You both worry too much. Matteo raised one thick eyebrow. You know what we are making. Adriano nodded reluctantly. A mirror, not an ordinary one, but a plate of glass so clear and flat that the world would appear inside it without distortion. That meant weeks of careful shaping, cooling, grinding, and polishing before the reflective backing could even be applied. Mirrors demanded patience. Something Adriano occasionally found overrated. Luca gestured toward the furnace. Reheat it. Adriano slid the rod back into the blazing chamber. The molten mass brightened instantly, glowing with a brilliance that forced him to squint. For a moment, none of them spoke. The only sounds were the furnace roaring and the faint creak of wood as the workshop slowly warmed under the growing heat. Outside, the village had begun to wake. Voices drifted faintly through the open doorway, along with the distant splash of oars against canal water. Travelers often paused along the road to watch the Bellini workshop. Glassmaking looked like sorcery to anyone unfamiliar with it. Sand entered the furnace. Objects emerged from fire. Adriano drew the rod from the oven again and began shaping the softened mass with wooden paddles soaked in water. Steam hissed where the damp tools touched the molten glass. The form slowly flattened. Luca watched carefully. Matteo watched more carefully still. When Adriano finally set the rod aside to cool, Luca examined the piece from several angles before giving a small nod. Acceptable, he said. Adriano grinned. High praise. Their father lifted the unfinished plate toward the window where daylight spilled across the surface. Even in its rough state, the glass held a curious clarity. The faintest reflections shimmered across it like ghosts trying to decide whether they existed. Matteo frowned slightly. Adriano asked. Nothing. The old man continued staring longer than necessary. Finally, he set the glass down. Continue, he said quietly. The work resumed. Hours passed in the slow rhythm familiar to every craftsman. Heat, shaping, cooling. The day advanced toward afternoon while the brothers moved between furnace and bench like musicians repeating a long-practiced performance. Adriano was polishing a finished piece near the open doorway when the sound of carriage wheels reached them from the road. That was unusual. Few visitors arrived in such fashion. He glanced up. A dark carriage had stopped beside the lane. Its polished body reflected the pale sky like still water. A driver remained seated at the front while another man stepped down onto the gravel road. The stranger paused briefly, studying the workshop with quiet interest before approaching. Adriano wiped his hands and nudged Luca. Customer. Luca looked up from his tools. The man entering the workshop carried himself with composed elegance. His coat was well-tailored but understated, and he removed his gloves slowly as he stepped into the warmth of the furnace room. His eyes moved across the glowing ovens and scattered tools with the careful curiosity of someone observing a laboratory rather than a shop. Matteo approached him. Good afternoon. Stranger inclined his head slightly. Signor Bellini, I presume. I am. My name is Alessandro Vierli. His voice was soft, educated, and oddly restrained, as though every word had been considered before being allowed to escape. I have heard remarkable things about your work, Vierli continued. Matteo gestured toward the workshop. We are Bellini. Glass is our inheritance. Venice has trusted our work for centuries. Vierli smiled faintly. Yes, it is not merely glass. His gaze settled briefly on the polished mirror plates stacked against the far wall. Even unfinished, they reflected the furnace light with remarkable clarity. I was told you create mirrors unlike any others in the region. And Luca exchanged a quick glance. That reputation had begun spreading further than they expected. Matteo folded his arms. We do our best. Vierli stepped closer to one of the mirror plates and studied his reflection in its smooth surface. The glass captured the room with startling sharpness. The glow of the furnace danced across it like liquid fire. For a moment he seemed lost in the image, then he spoke. I wish to commission a mirror. That can be arranged, Matteo said. Vierli turned slowly toward the family, but not an ordinary mirror. Air inside the workshop felt suddenly quieter, though the furnace still roared behind them. I require something exceptional, Vierli continued. A piece of glass flawless in its clarity. Tall enough to reflect a man entirely. Silvered with the greatest precision your craft allows. His eyes moved across the three Bellinis in turn. I want a mirror that sees perfectly. The words lingered strangely in the warm air of the furnace house. Adriano felt a small chill crawl across his shoulders despite the heat. Matteo studied the man carefully. Finally, he said, "Such a mirror would take time." Virely smiled again. "I have patience." Outside, the mist over the lagoon had long since vanished. But inside the Bellini workshop, something had quietly begun that none of them yet understood.